Okay, right. Welcome to this virtual Lean Agile Brighton meetup. Kind of a bit weird being back virtual again after having quite a few in-person ones again. But it's good to have Dan and Prateek back. Been over to the conference a good few times. Good supporters of us. This I think is going to be very informal. So I think I'll just leave Dan and Prateek to kind of kick off with a little bit of what's on their mind at the moment, what they're thinking about, and they may plug their books in the process. And then it's really going to be just let's have a conversation, Q&A. So if you've got a question, feel free to take yourself off mute and dive in, or put something in the chat and I'll keep an eye on the chat, or put your hand up and I'll try and keep an eye on that as well. And hopefully one way or the other, you'll get to contribute. So I'll hand it over to Dan or Prateek to kick off.
Prateek, why don't you go first?
Thank you for having us. Yeah, that's what having us here. Oh, we as we are want to do, we don't really have anything specific prepared, and we're hoping for this to be more of a Q&A thing. Obviously, Dan and I both have books out, which we've been talking about of late. Dan's book is more about, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, more about looking at predictability through some methods that have been around for a bit, and understanding our data in a deeper way using those methods. And mine is more about scaling without using any frameworks or any stuff like that. That's kind of where our books are. Those are the things that we have been talking about off late quite a bit. So that's kind of what those are the topics we can talk about. Now, if you have heard us talk about things, if you've heard Carl talk about things that have been bothering you, especially the latter, if you've heard Paul talk about things that have been bothering you, we're more than happy to talk about anything, really. So, Dan, anything to add to that?
No. Yeah, no, I think Prateek said it all. So really hoping that all of you have questions, because we'd like to make this more of a conversation rather than us. I mean, there's nothing more than the sound of our own voice that we like than the sound of our own voice, but I'd like to hear from all of you. So anybody want to kick us off with some questions about a book, about a topic, about anything?
Mike, I can see you got your hand up. You want to just kick us off then?
Yeah, why not?
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, my semi-perennial question these days is the impact of artificial intelligence on many things, but I guess you guys can talk to metrics and how it's going to impact metrics more generally, or Kanban more specifically.
You go, and then I'll correct you. That's normally how this goes.
We have been down this path a little bit. We haven't quite gotten to the machine learning stage of this, but Dan and I have been playing with some of this not of late, in the past. I'll come all the way around to answer your question, really. We started with things like Monte Carlo, and then we were like, okay, that's a cool static algorithm that goes back, pulls things, and gives you some answers that are probabilistic in nature. It's not necessarily AI, it's not necessarily machine learning, it's this thing. And then we started talking about, how do we make that more continuous? How do we, as things get done, as the algorithm learns, or as it gets new data, how does it, not learns, but as it gets new data, how does it give you better answers? Now we've moved into a continuous forecasting thing, but it's still not learning, it's still not AI. The next step that we took was we said, okay, we have this very simple model that's continuously forecasting. What if we made this model a little more complicated? We have a model that does random sampling. What if we did sampling of weekends from weekends, weekdays from weekdays, had like 5-6 different models, run those for a bunch of teams, and see if we can learn which model works best for what team, and kind of run that through. Now we get to the point where the machine itself starts learning which model works best for which team, And now we can do forecasting using, this is where we haven't gotten yet, but now that we know which models work best for which team, now our forecasting models could potentially adjust themselves based on how you have been performing to give you better and better forecasts. That's where, in terms of forecasting and flow metrics and all the Monte Carlo fancy stuff, that's the logical next step for AI and machine learning in terms of forecasting. How do we back test stuff using multiple different models and then go, oh, that model works best for this. Let's try using that. Now, there are multiple other implications of that. If you have a very complicated model that works best for you, it probably means you're doing something wrong. It probably means we need to simplify your process, not complicate the model. That's another place. So that's one application that we have played with a bit. Dan?
Yeah, taking a step back and maybe answering a little bit more broadly, because you did ask about Kanban and stuff like that. There's no doubt that AI will have some disruption, and I think it already is starting to disruption around training, around coaching, things like that. I've played around with some stuff myself, ran into some limitations. Also with data interpretation as well, because in a lot of the books that both of us have written, we detail rules of how to interpret data. The limitation that I'm not sure how we would get around with AI, although I assume there would be a way to do this. The limitation is the one caveat with all of data analysis, data interpretation, is that context is queen. You have to understand the context under which the data was collected, or it's essentially meaningless for the most part. Yeah, we can draw some conclusions, but without that contextual information. And so how do you feed that contextual information into AI? That's I think problematic. The other thing, if we talk about Monte Carlo simulation, the mechanics of Monte Carlo simulation are easy. I mean, simple. People try to make it a lot harder than it is, but it's really, really, really simple. The real art form, the real hard part of Monte Carlo simulation is actually setting up the model for what you're trying to simulate. We're just having the conversation this morning in a training that I was doing. And you have to be careful that you're setting up the model to answer the question that you really want to answer, because it came up, for example, I asked a question, how do you know, if you were to ask somebody the next item that starts, how do you know how long it will take for that item to finish? And they're like, easy, we'll set up a Monte Carlo simulation and say you do a Monte Carlo of 1. And it turns out that doesn't answer the question. It doesn't answer the question at all. But everybody thought, because they learned Monte Carlo, you just do a Monte Carlo simulation of 1. And so it's things like that I think, I don't know. Like I said, I'm sure there's some answer around AI somewhere, somehow, at some point in the future. I just haven't wrapped my head around that yet.
I wonder if I can give you 2 thoughts of my own on that. So first thought would be, I've loved your products for a very long time. Some of the free games that you guys have offered. But it seems to me that it would be prudent for you guys possibly to look at bringing in some expertise, even if it's a third party, to look at AI, because I think the tools that are going to offer that will be good because of how powerful AI potentially is, but also because I think just the market is going to want to find tools with AI. So there's a marketability aspect of it as well. And the second thought I had was, whilst I agree with you, data analytics is where people are putting a lot of their money, I'm quite fascinated about the stage after that, where AI potentially could suggest experiments given trends that it might see in your data. And that, to me, I think recommending micro experiments might be another place that AI could expose some value in the market.
I would agree with that, but again, those experiments would be predicated on understanding the context under which that data was first collected, right? Because you can imagine AI suggesting experiments that would be not only helpful but potentially very, very harmful. But yes, I mean I agree with both of those things.
And I think that's where it becomes a partnership, because you need to put in the guiding constraints for that AI to be able to sort of work in. guiding or enabling constraints. But I think that there's a potential there somewhere that I don't think has been properly explored at all at the moment. Anyway, thank you.
No doubt, no doubt, no doubt. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to explore something I've been thinking about a lot lately, the idea of experimentation, because so much when we hear in Agile people talking about experiments, and when they say experiment, they don't really mean experiment. They mean try something and pray, right? It's not really an experiment. So that's a topic and then the interpretation of the results is a big deal too, because really what they end up doing is more observational studies than experiments, and that's a whole philosophical rabbit hole that I'm happy to go down if anybody wants to go down that rabbit hole. But that, I don't know, that has either to do with either of our books, although it kind of does. It kind of does.
As Dave Snowden makes the distinction between experiments and probes. And I think what you're talking about, Dan, is more what Dave Snowden was for a probe. Just let's do something, and which is a valid thing to do. Is do something and see what happens. See how the system reacts, and then see what we can learn from that.
Yeah, but the interpretation of that data is different than the interpretation of I would argue the interpretation of experimental data. But
yep.
So just for those people who don't understand that, could you give a really brief example of the difference between the two? I think it'll help contextualize it again. Probe versus.
Yeah. So for and as always, I am going to defer to Dr. Wheeler. Everything that I know about this stuff, I just hand off to Dr. Donald Wheeler. And if you're not familiar with Dr. Donald Wheeler, his website's spcpress.com. And you can go, and he's got several papers out there about observational studies versus experiments. The idea of an observational study, I think, is just kind of like what Carl said. Try something and see what happens. That type of data you can throw in a process behavior chart, and just kind of interpret things that way. If we're talking about experimental data, what I would argue, this is my understanding, I'm willing to be corrected on this. The whole idea of an experiment is that it be replicated, is that it can be replicated. Otherwise, it's not really an experiment. Otherwise, it's one of these observational studies. And so while I think while that data can also be placed in a process behavior chart, there might be other types of analysis that are better. And this is where I think we get into like Bayesian statistics and things like that. So that's pretty much where my knowledge ends on that stuff. But I love what Carl said. I think it's okay just to say, hey, let's try something and see what happens. But that's not an experiment,
Yeah,
so.
I would differentiate them in an experiment. You have a hypothesis about what's going to happen. In a probe, you don't even have a hypothesis. You're just going to see what happens.
Yeah.
I saw was it Phil had their hand up briefly?
Hi, yeah, I did. Mine wasn't related though; it was a separate question, so I thought I'd wait until we'd finished.
Well, no, well, I would say go for it.
Okay, cool. Hey guys, really appreciate you taking the time out to do this. I guess kind of on the flip side of the previous question, I spent the last year working with machine learning teams. And one thing I found really difficult is, bringing in predictability and forecasting into machine learning work. By its very nature, there's a huge degree of kind of uncertainty there. And I've managed to convince a lot of our leadership that, right now we can't really do that and we have to accept that unknown. But one thing I'd really like to get from you guys is your view on that. Do you have any advice on how you could increase predictability and aid in forecasting with something like machine learning, or you're having to train and build models and see how well they work and kind of aim for that degree of accuracy before you release something out to your users? If you have any thoughts and advice on that, that would be great. Or do we just have to continue to accept that risk and the unknown nature of that way of working?
Well, let me say one thing, and then I just have one sentence to say probably. That's a fairly meta question, because the way that I understand it, machine learning is basically using a lot of the techniques we're talking about, and from a predictability perspective. It's figuring out probabilities and choosing the best answer based on probabilities. So that's it. Again, that's all I know. Prateek, you can answer better.
Yeah, it's actually it's kind of connected to the question we were asking earlier. It's what is probably doable is predicting how many probes or experiments we can run. That's probably predictable. Whether that will result in the outcome we're looking for, that might not be very predictable right now. Whether the actual problem we're trying to solve will get solved or not, that might not be very predictable. What we can predict is, by breaking our work up in a way where each little bit makes some progress, how many of those bits we can get done. That predictability we can have, because I love working with machine learning teams, because almost always the first, the smallest useful thing, the MVP we build, is a random number generator. What will randomly give me an answer? Now, how do I make that answer better? How do I make that answer better? What are the little bits that we do to make those answers better? That is predictable. Now, will we ever make it as good as we want it to be? We might not know that. That is something that as we run those models, we'll find out. But the predictability can come into how many of those little steps of making the model better we can have. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the answer. It's very valuable, actually. I can definitely take that away and work with the team on bringing that in. That's a lot more than what I've been doing and what I've managed to do. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think as more people do AI and machine learning work, I think the very first thing you build is a random number generator. This is something that gives you an absolute random answer. See if that's good enough. If it's not, let's make it a little better. Let's make it a little better. We don't have to jump to the most complicated thing up front.
I think it's almost just like, it's like kind of features and user stories. The LLM is the machine learning thing is the feature. You build the feature with lots and lots of user stories. You can maybe look back and say, how many experiments did we run for previous LLMs? And that's going to give us a bound. And then we can kind of go, well, how long is it going to take us to run that many experiments again? And that will give you some bounds. So you start kind of getting some idea, but with confidence intervals.
Yeah, I was speaking with a product manager of a company I cannot name, and they were talking about, hey, we're going to put in a recommendation engine, something that we're contracting out to this AI company. They're going to build a recommendation engine for us, and we're going to put that in and see what difference does that make to our sales. And also on their website, when you're looking for something, it will recommend things. And what they ended up doing was they ended up contracting to the company and also building a very basic recommendation engine internally to say, whatever you're looking at, give me an absolute random recommendation related to it. Like, if you're looking at cars, recommend me a random car. The difference between the AI model and that very basic random recommendation in performance was 4%. I mean, this was their data. It was the AI model was only 4% better than that random model. Turns out, actually having the recommendation engine, actually suggesting things, was the big gain. Not having the suggestions be super intelligent.
Random wins again.
All right. What other questions do people have?
You're also polite and raise your hand. Just
yeah. I'm not normally this polite.
Okay, I'll just go. So I guess this is mainly for Prateek, but Dan, please feel free to chip in as well. And it's an attempt to get you to plug your books, obviously, because that's why you're here. What would you say was kind of like a big key one takeaway that you would say to people in my company who maybe have kind of like are still very enamored with SAFe about why they should read your book?
Oh, this is you're okay. I'm glad you're limiting my whip to one. Frankly, the one takeaway would be that simple beats complicated. That's really what it is. Regardless of what you're doing, whether you're talking about a team's process, whether you're talking about an organization's process, the simplest thing you do will probably be better than a more complicated thing to do. unless you do the simple thing and it doesn't work and you have to add something to it and you have to add something to it. Start simple and then get to complex, complicated things. The simplest thing to do is usually the best. Dan and I have talked about this a little bit. We believe that you make progress by removing processes, by removing things that teams have to do, rather than adding things to what teams have to do. Removing it's the apocryphal story of Michelangelo that David was always there. He removed the bits from the marble that were not David. So that approach, that simple approach of simplifying your processes is usually much better than adding more complicated processes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
This reminds me of there's a Tim Harford does some writing, and he wrote something recently about taking stuff away. I think there's this research out there that if you ask people how to improve something, they will invariably add something, and they will very rarely recommend taking something away. It's human nature that we try to add things to improve them.
I'd probably come at it from, I mean, if I read Prateek's book, I'd probably come at it from a more economic standpoint. I'd love to know what's the return on investment of SAFe, and if you can't quantify that, why are you doing it? And if you can't quantify it, what is it? Because is it then justified? That's always been my objection with SAFe. It's not whether it's good or bad. I mean, I do have some of those objections, but it's more about, is it really worth that investment? It seems like the trend in Agile over the past, 20 years has been to make batches bigger and bigger and bigger. Whereas if you understand flow, that's probably the exact opposite of what you should be doing. So I don't see how the economics play out with SAFe. I just don't understand that.
I think I'd argue that that's the same for most agile transformations, though, because like people don't think about the economics of why they're doing it.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right. For sure. Yeah.
So kind of related to that, because it's touching on what I was doing today, actually. So my current gig is that there's a company that are organizing their delivery function around people utilization, and that's not working particularly well for them. And they're wanting to kind of strip out some of that and start an experiment with value streams and using flow as a way to kind of get product out the door. So there's some resistance to this. And one of the things we were talking about today is, what are the kind of balance metrics that we can show and use to kind of take this pilot project and say, put it up against the incumbent process and demonstrate that this is going to be better. What kind of metrics would you suggest would be useful for me to kind of focus on?
I sound like a broken record. I mean, I would personally, I would start with those 4 basic metrics of flow. That's I mean, just run before you can crawl. Is that right? That was a joke, by the way.
Yeah.
Whatever. As in kind of along the lines of what Prateek was saying, I'd keep it as simple as possible first and see if you can quantify improvement around those. Because my guess is you will be able to, if you're looking at utilization. My guess is there's probably pretty easy way to show some improvement in those metrics. And the beauty of those metrics is those are things that your customers will understand, or your stakeholders will understand.
Yeah. I mean, the challenge is that the company's very economically driven. So everything has to kind of, the most powerful thing that you can show them is something financial rather than necessarily cycle time, throughput, all of that kind of thing. So it's translating the 4 flow metrics into something that's tangible financially.
There's a, oh, go ahead, Prateek.
Yeah, that's and I thought Dan was going to go there, because I'm going to add the economics lens to this. It's like cycle time of a feature is essentially how much you invested in it. How long it took you to deliver something is, every day of cycle time has a cost.
Yeah.
This is how long, and the longer the cycle time, the greater the cost. Now we don't know if we're going to get return on this feature till people start using it.
Yeah.
So you're not able to control return. Only thing you can control is investment. Lowering that cycle time is the only way we can control investments. If we want to optimize for return on investment, well, we need to keep cycle times lower. And then WIP and age essentially lead to cycle times of that.
That reminds me of I think a conversation we had last time we were in London about measuring aging WIP, but measuring the aggregate aging WIP, because that is pure investment. The amount of work you have in process and how long it's so. Whereas if you have not a lot of work in process, it's not been in process for a very long time, that's a small investment.
So what are you saying, Carl? Across like a number of different like features or initiatives, the aggregate aging is across all of the things that might be on your board, and take number of days that is, and then turn that into a kind of figure. Okay.
Yeah.
And if you want to understand that WIP better, Dan's new book has entire chapters dedicated to total WIP age and how that goes. Yeah.
Just in full disclosure, though, the reason I'm a little hesitant to recommend that unhesitantly is because everything else that I talk about it from personal experience. You know, this is like, it's how I ran my company. It's what I always tell my clients, right? Total WIP age is one of these things that's purely in hypothesis land. We believe that this is the thing to do. We don't have any evidence, you know, pro or con to suggest whether it works or not. But I believe it is, you know, it is absolutely worth exploring, and it probably is you know, kind of the next evolution in this whole, I don't know, process thinking, whatever.
Cool. All right. Thank you. That's a lot.
Could I just suggest quickly that I think you may be approaching this from one angle, and I agree with everything that's been said, but I'm not sure that it's entirely correct. It seems to me that one thing that's missing is the conversation with the stakeholders that say, how is it that you're gonna, what can I do to make you feel that this is working? And until they have some confidence that the metrics represent value that they can believe in, all they're going to do is they're going to say, these are wonderful metrics, but they're meaningless to me. So if you can understand from their point of view how they're going to validate success, I think that needs to be part of this conversation as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you for your answers. Cheers.
And now maybe you could be the person that proves the hypothesis on total WIP age.
Maybe I could be.
No pressure.
No pressure at all.
We know of a couple of people who are trying it at this point, but Dan and I haven't tried it, so that's why we're like, it's a good hypothesis. We just don't know how easily it will work. Yeah.
All right. Anyone else? God, there must be some more questions.
Go on, I can jump in with one.
Oh, I bet.
Go on.
So I've been working with a team. We've been exploring some rapid reteaming. It's probably the way of putting it. So we've got a large team. We're giving them challenges, we're sort of forming around those. And I've been trying to get my head around how to use Monte Carlo and things like that for forecasting with those teams, because at story level, it feels quite hard to forecast because they're quite rapidly changing. So the dynamics change in the future is not always looking like the past. So I've been doing some forecasting at sort of the higher level, those bigger challenges we're dropping in and trying to track how long they'll take. But I'm wondering if you had any sort of other tips or ideas for things I could try out.
I would say, I mean, if here I'm going to channel our good friend Frank Vega. If you're in a situation where your teams are constantly changing, then that is your system, and you should be able. I mean, Monte Carlo is still valid in that case. So you can use historical data. If we say, hey, our teams are going to continue to change just like they've been changing in the past, that's probably a reasonable enough assumption to be using that historical data. I don't disagree with, you know, bubbling up to those higher levels. But I think you'll probably need to be able to do forecasting at all of those levels. But if that's your system, that's your system. Now, this is where we got to talk about all the other things we've been talking about. Is that system working for you? You know, is there an economic justification for it? Blah, blah, blah. But regardless of those, I don't think I haven't heard you say anything that would invalidate the use of just a, you know, a straight Monte Carlo approach. You know, because I'm an expert of your context now, having listened to you for about 10 seconds, you know, but just, you know, first blush, I don't hear anything. I know, Prateek.
No, agreed. And maybe you're tracking these metrics at both levels, right? And using level 1 to forecast level 1, level 2 to forecast level 2. That's completely valid. The flow metrics are the flow metrics and describing the system that you have, regardless of how dynamic that system is.
That's really useful. I hadn't thought about the idea of the system being stable as a result of being ever changing. So no, thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Weird since stable, but it is, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of like the weather. There are so many components active at all times, but they're still able to predict it because they look at it as an entire system.
No, thanks both. That's going to be really useful going into tomorrow, I think.
Good, yeah. But that's Frank Vega. I wish, Carl, you remember Frank, right? I mean, you remember Frank from way back when. Yeah, I wish he was still involved with the community a little bit more, because he's the one who usually has you know, the best words of wisdom, in my not so humble opinion.
One of my memories of Frank, kind of a tangent there. I remember we were talking about we were going to set up a conference that was called something like "Ooh, that's interesting" conference, where you just had to accept everybody's opinion and ask about it, be curious about it, rather than I think we'd just been to one of these conferences where it was just everybody slagging everybody else off.
Yeah, or only one person's opinion was allowed, right? One of those conferences.
Or maybe that was the same conference.
Yeah. I think getting back to kind of one of our earlier questions, I think that's probably my biggest frustration with Agile. Well, no, I don't know, biggest, top 5. There's so many biggest. This whole idea of, you know, whip of a sprint is 1. This is a thing now. I don't know if everybody's heard about that. Do not get me started on that. Well, that's something else we can talk about. I don't get that. But it's like there's always this not invented here thing. Most of these problems have been solved, and not only have they been solved, the solutions have been around for literally 100 years or more. But for whatever reason, we think we're different. You know, in Agile, we think we're different because I don't know why. And because that solution was documented in the 1920s, well, obviously that can't be applicable, you know, today. Our systems are complex, you know, our systems are whatever, you know, Knevin, Stacy, whatever you want to insert there. And I just think that's silly, for lack of a better word. You know, it's like we can learn so much from you know, all of this stuff, and most of it's not only been documented, but it's kind of proven mathematical fact. It's like you can't get around it. We're talking about experimentation now. We're even jumping even further to saying it's kind of established scientific theory, you know, a lot of this stuff. So I don't know, that's a bit of a soapbox of mine.
If you want to learn in detail about some of these techniques, Dan has a new book out called where he takes these techniques that are about 100 years old and applies them to our contexts.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually taking a step backward, trying to control a variable process with a fixed length time box. We've known that doesn't work for, like I said, decades, centuries even. But yet somehow we think that's a good way to control complexity, and all it does is make things worse, you know? So I don't know what to say to that. You know, I'm at a loss for words.
That is one that should have been a probe and not an experiment. That should have been, let's try this and find out if it actually works. And when it didn't work, like, okay, yeah, that didn't work. Let's get back to just looking at this as a continuous flow.
Yeah, but it didn't work because you weren't doing it right, or you weren't trying hard enough, Prateek.
That's a different problem.
That's why it didn't. That's
Well,
why it didn't.
it probably might have worked in one context, but that doesn't mean it's universally applicable.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the repeatability thing that I was getting to.
Well, I was like, we finally come back to the definition of experiment.
I was thinking about there. Right. To me, there are three things. I think Carl's right. There's a hypothesis. You've got a control for a variable, and then the results have to be repeatable.
Repeatable.
I mean, that's essentially what makes up an experiment, right? So
we solved it.
All right, we done?
Next. Yeah. World hunger.
All right. Who wants to dive in next? Otherwise, we'll have to ask Dan about the 1 story per sprint thing.
Have you seen that lately on? It's not 1 story.
It's not 1 story.
It's the whip of your sprint is 1.
I'm very intrigued by this now.
Yeah. No, I am genuinely intrigued because I've not come across it.
Oh, it's popped up in like my LinkedIn feed like 3 or 4 times in the past couple of weeks. Any sprint experts out there? Do you know what that? Because it took me a while to figure this out, and then I finally figured out what they were talking about. Why they say you're the Stuart. I hope you got enough to share. By the way.
I have a question actually.
Okay.
All right. Save us, Martin.
So following on the, it's all well known for at least 100 years. So why another book on the market? What's unique in those books which will contribute?
I think you kind of answered your own question there, because it's known, but it's not well known. And it's certainly not well known within our circles. And I think in some respects it's that this stuff's kind of been rejected, in our circles. So for me, that's why another book. And I'll be honest with you, I'll be the first one to put them. I write books that I want to read. So I'm always grateful when somebody else, likes to read the stuff that I like. But that's honestly my motivation for putting out a book. But I don't know. I mean, Carl, you remember back in the early days of Kanban, we talked about Deming a lot. We talked about Shewart to a lesser extent, but I don't know that I've ever been to a Scrum or a SAFe conference where they've said the name Deming or Shewart or Little or even contemporaries like Reinertsen and Wheeler. I've never.
That Deming gets mentioned in terms of the 12 or whatever it is.
14
management. Yeah, 16.
16. It's funny. He himself,
whatever.
He
yeah,
himself
so
put
exactly.
different numbers out there
Yeah.
in different writings.
So I've seen his principles mentioned, but they're very bit platitudinal.
Yeah.
Thrown in to make you look clever. But yeah, not the math stuff.
Well, that's even the principles. I am when I started reading Deming, I was like, why are we talking about the stuff in the Agile Manifesto? These principles are so much stronger and so much more valuable than anything in the Agile Manifesto. I prefer Deming's principles to that stuff. And Dan's talking about the more to the question from Austin. Both Dan and my books are more about, hey, we have all forgotten about this stuff. Maybe we need to get back to this rather than it's definitely not adding, as I said earlier, it's definitely not adding a lot. It's removing all the extra stuff we've added over the years to hopefully reintroduce these things.
Yeah. Well, I think both of us are trying to demonstrate that flow is flow is flow. It's one of those things that it's fairly applicable regardless of, your specific context. There's certain flow principles that are immutable. Now, obviously context does come into play in terms of implementation, but we know because of various scientific theory that you do certain things, you can expect certain outcomes. Right?
Does that help answer your question, Martin?
Thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. It's a fair question. Oh, Jack got the answer. Yep.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, yeah, one sprint goal,
Ugh.
which in some ways now makes sense, but equally it doesn't make sense still.
It doesn't make sense at all.
Like, but you might have goals that neatly fit into 2-week time boxes.
But for me, it's more about value. The value is not achieving the goal. That's you can deliver value without achieving a goal and vice versa, right? You can achieve a goal without delivering any value. And so when we talk about WIP, we're not talking about a goal. We're talking about, value delivery. And gets my blood pressure up. I need to stay off LinkedIn. I mean, I left Twitter. Now I'm gonna have to leave LinkedIn, right? I mean, I don't know.
But let's talk a little bit more about that, Dan. If
No.
it's getting...
Yeah. That's I don't know. Prateek, did you see that? The guy actually said, because the WIP of a sprint is 1, then aging doesn't matter. That was his statement. Did you see that? I don't know if you saw that.
Nope, I didn't see that.
Yeah,
that's good.
see?
That's good. That's good. That's good.
I don't want to hear anymore. I don't want to hear anymore.
Yeah. I'm just like, I think that I was having this conversation. Dan says it wasn't a conversation. It was something else because the entire building could hear us. I was having this conversation with a good friend of ours. And finally, when I drew a cumulative flow diagram of what that would look like, a stair step of goal, is where he was like, yeah, that's weird. That shouldn't be that way. Hey, we should be delivering value continuously rather than have a stair step pattern of whatever that is. So.
Yeah, I'm like, I always pile in on that. And it's like, what percentage of sprints actually achieve their goals? So anyway, yeah, that's.
Moving on.
I got another question, if that's all right. Sorry.
Yeah, go.
So towards the end of last year on your podcast, you were talking about voice of the process versus voice of the customer. I think I remembering back pre-Christmas, and I'm quite old, so my memory's fading anyway. Like, I suppose that I couldn't kind of think about tangible examples of how those two kind of conflict or support each other. Just wondered if you could kind of talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, this is great, because for me, that is the central question, whether you're doing Agile or not. How to get those two to map. I mean, I like to think when people talk about maturity models, the only maturity model is how far apart are those two voices. And when you talk about this not just from the perspective that we're coming at it from, which is it takes our process 20 days or less to produce something. Customer wants it in 10 days or less. Okay, now do we figure out how to make this stuff faster, or do we go set the right expectations with the customer so that the customer understands that it's not possible? So that's one way of managing it. Along with that, there are things like quality. Customer wants to make sure that when I drive this car for 20 years, it doesn't break down. Well, our cars are only good for 5 years and they break down. That's a mismatch in voice of the process and voice of the customer. There are multiple dimensions to that, but essentially, I believe all product development, all of the stuff comes down to how do you get those two things to match? How do you get what customer wants to match what your process produces by either making your process better or setting the right expectations with the customer?
Yeah, so is that expectation management then fundamentally, right? Just, here's the difference. And here's how we can either get our process to work that way or set expectations differently.
Expectation management and process improvement.
Yeah. Okay.
To me, everything else is just stuff we have added on top of it. That is the thing that actually matters.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
The other key thing I took from that podcast is in terms of the expectation, that it has to be justifiable expectation. A lot of the voice to the customer we come across probably is like, I want it tomorrow, which with no rationale behind it.
But taken to its further logical end, that's essentially free market. Go see if someone else can do it tomorrow. And if you, I mean, if you have the best product and with the best predictability in market, the customer will have to come back to you. Someone in the comments, because I just noticed the comments, had asked about Nisha. So just real quick, just so everyone can see her.
Nisha.
Passed out by the bar as usual.
Yeah. Mike is, yeah, I don't know if you saw in the chat too. Mike's just trying to make me angry, I think. Sorry.
We have fun
trying to get you to
with
try some
angry
of that.
Dan. We you get worked up about things, and the rest of us are enjoying it.
I'm glad I'm good entertainment for you, Neve. Thanks.
Just so you know, any random day, if you're feeling down, you just call Dan and get him worked up on something, and it makes your day better.
So talking about Djokovic, yeah.
Yeah. No, Dan was on a PSK course that Dan did last year, and we managed to wind Ryan Ripley up quite badly about his taste in music. So there's opportunities.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
Hey, maybe we should do certification in winding Dan up. There'll be a market for that.
Yeah.
It's too easy. It's too
one.
easy. Yeah. Anybody can do that. It's too easy.
What else can we wind Dan up about?
Not necessarily.
I'll go.
Suddenly everybody piles in.
No, I was wondering, is there anything positive you can think of that could come out of arbitrary time boxes?
You go.
No,
you go.
Go.
You go. No, you go.
Positive that can come out is what Nicholas Taleb calls a black swan event. Every once in a while, you will get your timing perfectly right, and magical things will happen. That is the only thing I can think of, because almost everything else is we could have gotten it a little earlier, a little later, much earlier, much later. But every once in a while, you'll have that the stars perfectly align and you got the timing exactly perfectly right. But other than that, I'm lost for a great positive out of it.
So I mean, I want to be clear about my language, because I'm almost certainly not as clear as I need to be. A time box in and of itself, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, an evil thing. A fixed length, consistently fixed length time box where events are tightly coupled to that time box, I think is inherently evil. And does more harm than good.
You missed the keyword arbitrary.
Arbitrary, sorry.
Arbitrary.
Arbitrary.
Fixed,
that's the word.
Fixed length, arbitrary.
Arbitrary, yes. Because yes, to what we were talking about before, you theoretically could come up with a time box that is the voice of the process. But even then, there would be some probabilistic nature to it, You could think of the way that we talk about SLEs as kind of a time box, but there's a probabilistic nature to it. It's when it's fixed length, arbitrarily fixed length, where events are coupled to it. And when the time box expires, everything else has to finish. That's what's evil.
Thank you both.
Yeah, for me, I'd say it's the feedback. So the time box gives you that feedback cadence. It's when everything else gets coupled to that cadence that things potentially start going wrong.
Yeah, and then we have to have a philosophical debate over time boxes and cadences, because I'm not convinced cadence is a good thing, but time boxes maybe. Time boxes maybe. I'm not sure the cadence is, but yeah.
Say more about
that. What's that?
Say more about that. I'm surprised by that answer, so I'm curious.
Okay, we have to make sure that now I'm going to channel Frank again. Have to make sure we're talking about, when you say cadence, you're talking about doing something at the same time on a regular, repeatable.
Yeah, regular rhythm of let's just check in and get some feedback on what we've done, what we've learned.
Yeah.
What,
So my
and use that to pivot if we need to.
Yeah, and so my favorite, and again, this is, we should have Frank on this, because most people think, like, say, okay, it's like if we were to remove the sprint, we could still have a cadence of our retrospective being every 2 weeks, and maybe we have a planning meeting being every 3 weeks, and maybe have a review being every 4 weeks or whatever. We could let those things, but still offer them on a cadence. And one of the most successful ways that I ever did this, that I learned from Frank, is remember back in the days when we used to go in the office and have whiteboards? Do you remember? I don't know if I remember this. We could do this. We'd have a Kanban board, and we had a piece of paper that was right next to the Kanban board, and the title of the piece of paper was Topics for a Retrospective, and we put a WIP limit on it. Had a WIP limit of 3. And so anytime somebody thought of a topic for a retrospective, they'd go and they'd write it up on that sheet of paper. And the second we hit 3, we stopped whatever we're doing and we had a retrospective. No cadence, no time box, no anything, right? We just kind of did it just in time. And so that's why I think this is just Dan, I favor more just in time than any type of cadence. That's my thinking.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So now I do see the flip side of that, of we don't necessarily want to go too long without meeting if there's nothing, so that's where potentially a time box comes into play, but even then.
But it's more of a loose boundary than a time box.
Yeah.
So say, I don't want to go more than 3 weeks without having talked about stuff. So yeah, but if something happens before that we want to talk about, sure.
Jake's favorite, because because they had, what was it, every 2 weeks you're doing retrospectives? Is that what it was?
Yeah.
And the number one topic was why can't we get better snacks? Isn't that it, or something?
Yeah. Whenever if the first topic in the retrospective is why can't we get better snacks, it means the retrospective 2 weeks is too frequent. We need to push this thing out. We can't do it every 2 weeks.
But clearly you weren't making that retrospective very actionable.
Yeah.
Like, why weren't you getting better snacks?
Yeah, seriously. Yeah,
seriously, why weren't you?
Obviously, that was the problem. Turns out their cycle times improved because we weren't getting better snacks. So I didn't want to try that experiment.
Keep them hungry.
Keep them hungry.
Treat them mean, keep them keen. Is that it? Yeah, you went to the. We went to the
that thing where you put the snack at the end of the Kanban board, and when you finish a piece of work, you get to eat the snack.
You get it. Yeah. You deposit a physical card in order to get it. It's like a vending machine.
Oh, we can have.
That could have been your hypothesis for an experiment. If I improve the stacks, will improve?
Yeah. Will your cycle times go down? Will we get faster feedback? Yeah.
That reminds me of my favorite Carl debate, and we should maybe have everybody here debate it. It's like, what is a Kanban on a Kanban board? I love that's. Carl and I debate this all the time. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts about this. That's something we can talk about, or we can be done too. We're kind of at the hour mark.
We take a vote at the end of it, see which one of us is right.
Maybe.
God, anyone want to dive in with their thoughts on what is a Kanban or a Kanban? Do you want to go then, Dan?
I can.
Go on, Anastasia.
Yes. So Kanban is a strategy to optimize the workflow.
Yep. So yeah, yep. You are exactly right. Gold star. So we are talking now. So within that strategy, we're talking more about the Kanban pull system, the Kanban type of pull system. So if you're operating a Kanban pull system to do Kanban, I know that sounds weird, but that actually sentence makes sense, believe it or not. What is the Kanban in the way that we talk about in knowledge work? What is the Kanban, on a Kanban board?
Gonna plump and probably set off lots of alarms.
Okay.
It's like UI.
Is it something representing a piece of value? Is that the Kanban on the Kanban board?
You've been talking to Carl too much, Stuart. So you are squarely
Yeah,
in the
probably so.
Carl camp.
Yeah, but I know what you're going to say, Dan. Well, I obviously know because you took this part.
Actually, maybe you should represent me and I should represent you. Maybe that's how we should debate this. You know, but
yeah, it could be. So I suspect. So I kind of think of the Kanban. If you take the traditional the translation, it's the visual token. The index cards or post-its are visualizing the work, but that's not necessarily the pull signal. The pull signal is the lack of a Kanban. Chris Matz put something on LinkedIn. Speaking of LinkedIn, in response to something by Nigel Thurlow, where Nigel was ranting about Kanban and interpretations of Kanban. But he reminded me that back in the early days, I think Eric was involved in that, Eric Walecki, but we coined the phrase Kanban sucks. Probably an ironic, it was the time when everybody was slagging off Kanban and we kind of go, yeah, Kanban sucks. But what we meant is when you move a piece of card, it kind of creates a hole in that in the Kanban board, and that hole sucks in the next piece of work. So it's kind of the lack of Kanban. If we're being technical about it, there's the signal that you can pull work. I still kind of say, hey, it's the token. Is this visualizing all that? It's like it's a virtual Kanban, but that's a name that I don't like anymore.
Well, we can agree on that. I don't like Kanban, the word Kanban at all, virtual or otherwise. Yeah. I would argue, just so everybody knows, I agree with Carl everything up until the last thing, because the actual post-it note for me is inventory. That represents inventory. That's not a Kanban. And so that's what we're trying to visualize is our inventory, so that we can see the Kanban, which is the empty spot. But
yeah.
It's much easier if you replace the word Kanban with pull signal.
Yeah.
The pull signal is the lack of a card, not the presence of a card.
But these are the things we talk about when we're drunk at Kanban conferences. So take it for what you will, right? I mean, yeah.
All right. Any more questions? Kind of keeping on the time. We mean just going about an hour, but so we will probably wrap up soon. But any burning questions? Now's your chance. Okay, so I think Jack's put something. I think Jack said he was on a train. So
okay.
So I'm going to read his question out. It's very long. Hypothetical situation based on a few experiences in the past. Imagine a stakeholder asks for something to be delivered by the end of H1 that is pretty clearly too big to deliver in that time. Brand new team, so zero historical data to point at. It's just gut feel at this point. Looks like it might be a multi-year thing based on how much is involved to go from idea to delivered. Stakeholders needs the thing delivered on time because it's baked into a budget, and if it misses the date, they won't get their bonus. They ask why we can't just double the team size working on it so we can do it in twice as quickly. Aside from just saying, obviously it doesn't work like that, and ignoring the cultural challenges of bonuses, why bonus being tied to delivering a value number can't be accurately predicted. Any more thoughts on a more scientific / mathematical response to this? Don't ask me to read that again.
I don't know about scientific mathematical, but I'm sure I know Prateek was going to jump in with something. I know he had.
I mean, I've got too many things. I'll tell you the thing that actually something I was reading about yesterday, last night, and Dan, I was going to talk about this with you earlier, but we didn't get a chance. When you have a very congested highway, one thing that people often do or suggest to do is add lanes to the highway. That's a way to solve the problem. There have been multiple studies, especially in the US, where all we do is drive cars instead of take public transportation. There have been multiple studies that adding lanes to the highway actually makes things worse. It actually increases commute times. So adding more people or doubling the size of the team actually will make things worse. You will actually take even longer to deliver this thing than you would with your current team. That's the first thing that jumped into my mind. I know there's a whole bunch of continuous forecasting stuff that we can talk about here too.
Well, I thought you were going to go the slicing route. I thought you were going to say,
yeah, there's that too.
Yeah.
there's we can almost certainly size this such that we deliver something in H1 that gives us some type of feedback that the stakeholder might see as valuable, that will help us to understand if this is something that we should continue doing. So I know product people. Prateek knows there's one person that I love to always pick on, but they always think something's this big when usually you can deliver this much and get enough feedback to know whether it's worth going forward or not. And that's maybe how I would want to start to frame the conversation, a little bit. Yeah, we think it's this big. Okay, what's to Prateek's word? What's smallest usable thing? Is that what you say?
Smallest useful thing.
Smallest feedbackable thing, whatever.
Smallest feedbackable thing. Yeah. Smallest useful thing is something I picked up from Paul Brown. But yeah, smallest feedbackable thing. What is the smallest thing we can do so we can get feedback of is this thing even valuable for us? Now, in Jack's hypothetical scenario, I am sure there's going to be a thing of, but I don't get my bonus if I don't do the whole thing. And you're in that tight corner. I don't know if there's anything that can help you at that point.
Yeah.
I would have thought, so one, I'm going to trigger you both probably because I'm going to talk about prioritizing by value, but slice it down and start with the most valuable thing so that when you get to the deadline, you've delivered the most valuable stuff. And now I'll kind of leave you to rant at why that's a wrong thing to do.
There's no problem with prioritizing with value as long as you assume going into it that you're wrong.
Yeah.
Let me put it that way. Most people want to assume that they're right, but chances are you're wrong.
Yeah. So how do you validate that value hypothesis quickly?
As quickly as possible.
As quickly as possible.
Yeah.
How do we find out how wrong we are as quickly as possible?
Jack's asked about whether you got a link for the highway example.
I'll find it. I can find the YouTube video. I'm looking for good studies to quote, but I can find the YouTube video where this was.
Cool. All right. So if you let me know, or just add it to the meetup in the comment or something when you find it. Okay. Should we give it one last question before we wrap it up?
Last one. Who was the last one?
So I'm going to say the best to last.
Something that really triggers Dan. Let's go for it.
Neve, we're looking at you.
I've got nothing that would.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
I can start to trigger you by asking about Jira and things like that, but I don't want to go there.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be kind to all of us.
Well, maybe we've just come to a natural end.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the time box has 52 minutes left.
Have we met our goal though? That's a nil for setting such a big time box. I blame Anil for that one. Need to do shorter time boxes, Anil.
Yeah, I'll take that feedback on board, Carl.
Yeah. So you need your next retrospective in another 2 weeks. All right. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining. Thanks to Dan and Prateek for answering questions, providing some entertainment for us. Buy their books. And then the last thing I'm going to plug, we have our next conference again in October. So tickets are on sale. I'm just going to whack the link to Ticket Tailor in there. Super early bird prices at the moment. So get a bargain. We're working on the program as we, I was going to say as we speak, but not as we speak. But we're in the process of figuring out the program and hopefully start getting some announcements out soon. So hopefully see you there. And I don't know whether we'll get Dan and Prateek over again this year. We'll see. We'll have to discuss as a committee whether we want to invite them.
Yeah, needs a new t-shirt.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, exactly. And then you've got no excuses.
I mean, I just want to say, ever since Lean Agile Scotland kind of went off the rails, Lean Agile Brighton is my favorite conference in the UK now. I mean, if I'm able to make one, and I hopefully my track record has kind of proven that one out. But thanks so much to all of you for taking time out of your busy evening to come listen to us rant about stupid stuff, stupid process stuff. Really enjoy the opportunity to come and talk to you. Thanks to Carl for setting this up and for the invitation. And like you said, hoping to see you all later this year if it works out.
Yeah, and you're over in London for Lean Agile London as well in May.
I am.
Yeah,
In May.
in May.
Yep.
In May.
Yep.
Yep.
All right, so I'll see you
Brilliant.
then. We may see you then.
Brilliant.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks,
Cheers, everyone.
everyone.
See you
Thanks
soon.
so much.
Thanks,
Okay.
Dan.
Soon.
Cheers,
Okay.
Prateek.
Cheers.